Hello, everybody, and welcome to the webinar on navigating global allergen labelling, where we will cut through the complexity of different markets as we work in a high-risk intersection of consumer protection, scientific nuance, and regulatory divergence. Today's webinar will cover the following aspects. First, I'll start with an introduction and some context to why this topic is so critical for food businesses. We'll look at why food labelling, allergen labelling, is considered high risk and why it's so heavily regulated worldwide. And I'll share recent enforcement trends and recall data from key jurisdictions so you can see the real world impact of non-compliance. We'll move into a global overview of regulatory requirements, starting with the Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Health Organization scientific risk-based analysis and lists for allergens. We'll compare allergen lists across jurisdictions. From there, we'll do deep dives into specific regions. For this webinar, the US, Australia and New Zealand, European Union, Great Britain, and China. Once we've covered the regulations, we'll shift to some practical implementation strategies, tips on how to harmonise multi-jurisdictional labels, and ideas on how to manage translation, font size, and formatting constraints. Finally, we'll wrap up with a Q&A session where I'll answer your questions and discuss any challenges you're facing. So that's our roadmap for today. Let's get started. Thank you for my introduction just before. As you've just been told, I am the regulatory manager in the Australian office for Ashbury and have quite a few decades of regulatory work in the food space over my career, as I was an enforcement officer for the New South Wales Food Authority, which gave me a first-hand insight into how regulations are applied and where businesses often go wrong. So I use that experience to help companies navigate these complex requirements. Just after I've introduced myself, I just would like to introduce you to Ashbury. Ashbury was founded with a clear mission to give retailers and manufacturers complete confidence that their product information is compliant while supporting consumers in making safe and informed choices. We're a regulatory, technical and training consultancy specialising in labelling and compositional compliance across a wide range of product categories and global markets. Today, we work with clients in over 80 countries, speak more than 35 languages, and have completed over 200,000 projects. With that experience, we're well equipped to help you navigate the complex world of food allergen labelling with clarity and confidence. Our headquarters are based in central London with satellite offices in Washington, DC and Melbourne. So let's turn to the first part of this webinar, introduction and context. Allergen labelling is one of the most critical aspects of food safety because even a small error can have life-changing consequences for consumers and significant reputational impacts for brands. The challenge is that global rules are fragmented, making it difficult for businesses to create labels that are both consistent and compliant across all markets. Globally, undeclared allergens remain one of the leading causes of food recalls. So it isn't just a regulatory issue, it's indeed a public health issue. A single missed word or formatting error can have life-threatening consequences coupled with brand damage. Regulators know this, which is why they require not only accuracy, but also accessibility, with clear language, consistent formatting and visibility on all food package. It's about making sure the information is easy to find and easy to understand. For businesses, the stakes are high. Non-compliance doesn't mean just fines. It can damage brand trust, lead to litigation, and most importantly, harm consumers. So allergen labelling is both a legal obligation and a moral responsibility. One of the biggest challenges for allergen labelling is that there is no single global standard. A product sold in multiple markets must comply with the completely different rule books, and those differences aren't minor. For example, in the US, FALCOPA and FASTA Act find 9 major allergen groups, including sesame, which was only recently added. In Australia and New Zealand, the peel standard introduced a few years ago goes further, requiring bold text, specific terminology, and a summary contained statement. The EU and Great Britain have their own list under Annex 2, plus diverging expectations for precautionary allergen labelling. And also China is now moving towards mandatory allergen labelling, which will apply in 2027. So the result, the same formulation will require completely different declarations and formats depending on where it's sold. This fragmentation obviously creates complexity, cost and risk for businesses. Undeclared allergens have become one of the biggest compliance headaches for regulators worldwide. They're now a leading cause of food recalls in almost every market. In the US, label-related recalls are nearly 3 times common than those caused by particularly Listeria monocytogenes. And when you look closer, 84% of those labelling errors came down to undeclared allergens. That's a huge proportion. Australia and New Zealand show a similar pattern. Between 2020 and 2024, FSANZ coordinated over 200 recalls, and year after year, nearly half or more were due to undeclared allergens. In fact, in 2024, that number jumped to 57% of all recalls that year. The EU and Great Britain are no different. Allergens have overtaken microbial hazards as the leading cause of food recalls, with recent data showing that 35% of alerts this year were triggered by allergen labelling issues or cross-contamination. Regulators are shifting their focus. It's no longer just about controlling microbial hazards within your systems. It's about labelling accuracy, ingredient traceability, and robust allergen control systems all the time. Now that we've just briefly introduced the challenges of fragmented regulations, I just want to shift to what businesses can do to start thinking, or indeed continue to be thinking about in the back of their mind. This slide shows the 3 pillars that turn allergen compliance from a legal requirement into the operational strength of your business. At the end of the webinar, I'll return to these concepts of the 3 pillars for practical implementation of the global allergen requirements. Right now, I'm just introducing the concept to ensure that you are thinking about these, about the implementation and how it would look within your established systems. And the first pillar is the global allergen specifications. This is your foundation, a single source of truth that defines allergen declarations, formatting rules, and precautionary statements for each jurisdiction. When this is clear and centralised, your artwork teams can produce compliant labels without guesswork repetitively. The second pillar is the supplier assurance and verification. Your label is only as accurate as your ingredient data. If a supplier changes a formulation or introduces a new allergen, you need systems that catch it immediately. This means embedding allergen checks into audits, contracts, and pre-production verification, maintaining traceability throughout the supply chain. The third pillar is future-proofing. As we will see, regulations evolve constantly. China's mandatory allergen labelling comes into effect in 2027, and other jurisdictions have been updating their rules over the last few years. Building flexibility into your specifications and workflows and monitoring changes proactively ensures you can adapt quickly without disruption. So now that we've covered why allergen labelling matters and the operational pillars for managing it in a very high-level overview, let's look at the regulatory landscape itself. We'll start this section with an overview of the global allergen risk-based list from the FAO/WHO, and then take a high-level view at the allergen lists and how each allergen name is treated in the markets that we're looking at this afternoon. We will see where declarations are the same and then highlight where they diverge. Before moving into the deep dives in the next section, we'll look across the specific jurisdictions in a useful at-a-glance way. So when we talk about jurisdictional differences in allergen labelling, a good starting point is the FAO-WHO framework. They've developed two key lists that all jurisdictions respond to, reference. Global priority allergens and allergens of national or regional significance. The two lists are based on a risk-based approach and consider factors like prevalence, potency, and severity of allergenic reactions. The goal is to provide scientific advice that informs labelling and allergen management worldwide. The global priority allergens include milk, egg, peanut, 6 tree nuts, sesame, fish, crustacean, and cereal grains containing gluten, specifically wheat, rye, and barley. Then there's a second category, allergens of national or regional importance. These include soy, 3 additional tree nuts, Brazil nut, macadamia, and pine nut, as well as celery, lupin, mustard, buckwheat, and oats. Sulfites aren't covered under the FAO WHO code lists, but they're often included in national regulations. So we keep them in mind, and I've included them in the tables that we look at. From here, we'll look at how these global recommendations translate or don't into mandatory declarations in different jurisdictions. And we'll highlight where the differences create challenges. So I just want us to look at an at-a-glance table designed to show what each jurisdiction requires of the FAO-WHO priority allergens and plus sulfite at the bottom. It's a quick way to visualise the complexity businesses face when trying to create compliant labels across multiple markets. On the vertical axis, you'll see those allergens from the World Health Organization's list. Across the horizontal columns, we have the jurisdictions, the US, Australia, New Zealand, European Union, and Great Britain, and China. What this table highlights is that while there's overlap with those top major allergens, milk, egg, peanut, and tree nuts are universally required, there are important differences. For example, the US mandates sesame since the FASTA Act, but does not require mollusks or sulfates to be declared. Australia and New Zealand require individual tree nuts, cereals, and even lupin plus sulfate over 10 milligrams per kilo. So not 10 parts per million. The EU and Great Britain include mustard, celery, and mollusks, which are not required in the US. And China's new standard will require 8 major allergens, but its list is narrower than the EU's and excludes some regional specific allergens like mustard and celery. You'll also see I've highlighted certain names that are different in the United States. The requirement is for the common name to be used, and in their advisory documentation, additional names are provided for walnut and pine nut, and for instance, certain other requirements in the United States require for nuts to be after macadamia, but in the European Union and United Kingdom, you also require nuts to be after pistachio. That's not a requirement in any of the other jurisdictions. Sesame seeds also is the proper declaration for sesame in EU, Great Britain, whereas the other jurisdictions, only sesame can be actually used in a declaration. Here is a comparison slide, and that provides an overview of the specific allergens for mandatory declaration, but as well as taking it to a step further, and it doesn't actually show which allergens are mandatory in each jurisdiction. It includes the rules for where and how those declarations are to appear on the label. This is obviously quite a summarised version, so it's really just to be not to necessarily taken as your authority piece. Indeed, your primary material in all instances is your authority pieces, but I want to provide that opportunity to really look at an at-a-glance requirement of the various differences as they go against the jurisdiction. The placement requirements vary significantly. For example, in the US, requires allergens to be declared either in the ingredient list or in a separate contained statement, while Australia and New Zealand mandate both, bolding in the ingredient list and a summary statement in a specific location next to the ingredients list. Formatting rules also differ. The EU requires allergens to be emphasised within the ingredient list, usually by bold, but does not mandate a separate summary statement. China's upcoming standard will require allergens to be clearly identified, but the exact formatting rules are still evolving. Some jurisdictions have strict language requirements. For example, Peel in Australia and New Zealand specifies exact terminology for allergens, while the US allows some flexibility as long as a common name is used. Now that we've seen the big picture, it's time to drill down into the details. In this next section, we'll take a closer look at the major markets. So starting with the United States, allergen labelling here is driven by two key laws, the Food Allergen Labelling and Consumer Protection Act, or the FALCPA, and the Food Allergy Safety Treatment Education and Research Act, or FASTA Act, which came in more recently. Packaged foods regulated by the FDA must declare any of the major allergens using the name of the food source. These include milk, eggs, peanuts, tree nuts, and where you have to name the specific nut. Wheat, soybeans, fish, and crustaceans, shellfish. So if you've got shrimp or crab, you need to call them out by the name, and then in the brackets, you have the allergen, crustacean. The FASTA Act added sesame to the list, making it the 9th major allergen in that jurisdiction. That requirement kicked in at the start of 2023. So sesame now has to be declared just like the other allergens. How do you declare them? Well, there are 3 options for food allergens listing in the US. This slide shows 2 of these ways of presenting food allergen information on pre-packaged foods. Please be aware, however, the individual state laws may also apply. And this example is taken from the FDA side about the Food Allergen Labelling and Consumer Protection Act. Unlike Australia and New Zealand and the EU and Great Britain, foods sold in the US do not require allergens in bold or underlying their name. And depending on the option applied, a contained statement is not mandatory. The third option for the US is seen here. Again, there's no bolding or highlighting used, and also no contained statement equivalent to the Australian Peel summary statements required. You can also see that, like the EU and Great Britain, it is possible to use an allergen advisory statement equivalent to a may contains or PAL statement. But as with the EU and GB, this must be based on thorough risk assessments and strict allergen controls, failing to prevent the possibility of cross-contamination. So a key message in allergen control is always keep your documentation and manufacturing systems in sync with the artwork. This ensures consistency and reduces the risk of non-compliance. Always verify supplier specifications, especially for sesame and tree nut species. The plain English name of tree nuts include but are not limited to almond, Brazil nut, cashew, chestnut. These are high-risk allergens and require precise identification. Secondly, make sure your contained statements are locked in your labelling software. Avoid free typing wherever is possible within your IT programs. This helps prevent human error and ensures consistency over products. Third, if you're using precautionary allergen labelling or PAL, like may contain, it must be based on a documented cross-contact risk assessment. Evidence must support these claims. They cannot be blanket statements across a range of food. Finally, for multi-unit packets or products with shared claims, ensure that allergen declarations are replicated consistently across each unit and on the outer packaging. Now let's just turn for a moment to look closely at the time when sesame became a regulated major allergen under the FASTA Act on 1st of January 2023. That change meant manufacturers had to meet strict requirements, validated cleaning, proper segregation, updated allergen controls. If they didn't, the risk was cross-contact and undeclared sesame, which triggers a Class 1 recall. Many recalls in the US in 2023 happened for exactly this reason. Big controversy came from how some bakeries responded. Sesame is incredibly hard to clean from equipment. Tiny, oily, it sticks everywhere. Validating cleaning for sesame is expensive and time-consuming. So instead of investing in cleaning, some facilities started adding sesame to products that were previously sesame-free. By doing that, they could legally label contain sesame and avoid the risk of accidental contamination. It wasn't a food safety improvement, it was an operational workaround, and it became widespread. On the other side of this, facilities that didn't update their sanitation procedures faced major problems. Recalls cited unclean equipment, shared lines, poor changeovers, incomplete cleaning validation systems. Sesame residues are hard to eliminate because they embed in the belts, the mixers, ovens, and even travel through the air during topping applications. Removing all traces requires major operational changes and specialised cleaning. The FDA warned the industry early on. Update your cleaning validations, revise allergen control plans, train your staff, and use rapid tests. Plans that ignored this ended up with contamination and costly recalls. The key takeaway here is that when an allergen becomes regulated, you cannot just tweak a label. You need a full operational shift. Turning now to Australia and New Zealand, which requires all foods to comply with an updated Food Standards Code standard known as PEAL, Plain English Allergen Labelling. And the change sets strict rules for when allergen declarations appear, how they look, and what words you can use. We've been in a transition period where anything packed before 24 February 2024 can remain on the shelves until 24 February next year. After that, everything must meet PEAL. So what's new? Allergenic ingredients must be declared using the prescribed required names from Schedule 9 in brackets following the ingredient in the ingredient list. The allergens of processing aids must now be declared at the end of the statement of ingredients in brackets after the word processing aid. The summary statement must be distinctly separated from ingredients list and directly next to it with no other words. You'll see the illustration here with the small letters 1, 2 next to processing aids, and 3. And for example, only the required names from Schedule 9 can be used. And some names differ between the ingredient list and the summary, which is always good. For example, gluten appears only in the summary statement, never in the ingredient list when you declare wheat. or any other gluten-containing cereal. Also, tree nuts can no longer be listed as just tree nuts anymore. You have to name each one, like almond, cashew, walnut, and so on. There are also changes for soybeans, gluten cereals, and mollusks. We in Australia are quite strict in regards to the formatting on the actual label. There are to be no, for example, characterising ingredient statements in between the ingredient list and the summary statement of allergens. The summary statement must be directly next to, but distinctly separate from, the statement of ingredients. For example, the summary statement cannot be on the same line as a continuation of the ingredient list. Two categories of food are exempt: food for special medicinal purposes and infant formula for special dietary use. They keep the old allergen rules of declaration as per the original standards. And one last point, peel doesn't affect, again, precautionary statements like may contain peanuts. They remain voluntary. So let's go through the common mistakes we see with peel compliance in Australia. First, forgetting to list tree nut species individually. Under peel, you can't just say tree nuts. Using non-required names, for example, writing dairy instead of milk is no longer allowed. You have to use the exact required name from Schedule 9, being milk, and in the brackets after the ingredient. Third, the summary statement placement must be right next to the ingredient list. Bolding is now mandated. Every instance of the required name must be in bold, even inside the ingredient list. For example, milk chocolate must have the milk in both instances for the milk chocolate compound ingredient, as well as the milk solids ingredient in the brackets. Declaring gluten incorrectly is quite common. Gluten should never appear in the ingredient list. We have some examples here of non-compliant ingredient lists that demonstrate some of these errors. Also shown in the tall, long image allergens such as wheat and oats are not bolded here, and they should be. Wheat containing gluten must now be mentioned as the two allergens on the label. So down here we've got allergens spelt wrong. It should actually be wheat and gluten there, as well as any other allergens in that list. The cheese label here is arguably non-compliant, as it has the contains statement contains milk squished in a paragraph when it needs to be distinctly separate from the ingredient list. Turning to the EU regulatory system now, Regulation 1169/2011 is the main law for allergen labelling in Europe. It's been enforced since December 2014 and applies to all foods sold to consumers, whether prepackaged or non-prepacked, including online and distance sales. For packaged foods, which is what we are limiting ourselves to here tonight, the regulation requires allergens to be clearly highlighted in the ingredient list. It means using emphasis like a bold font, different style or background colour, so they stand out from other ingredients. There is no ingredient list. You must use the word contains, followed by the allergen name. Standard statement for allergens, see ingredient in bold, is also used. There are 14 allergens listed in Annex 2 that may also be declared when present. Cereals containing gluten, and as the list is written there, I won't read it out. Let's just take a moment to talk about allergens and food recalls in the EU. Undeclared allergens account for about 30% of food recalls across the EU. It's a significant chunk now. And milk is the leader, responsible for about 35%, nuts at about 25%. Sesame and eggs each are around 15% of allergen-related recalls. A few examples recently this year with milk protein found in potato chips from Poland and sesame detected in poppy seed paste imported from Turkey. Allergen management needs to be front and centre in food safety programs. Really isn't just a regulatory box to tick. when you're dealing with multiple languages on labels, it's about consistency and compliance. A few simple habits can save you a lot of headaches. I'll share some key tips here. Seriously, have one master mapping sheet for all your translations. It's your single source of truth and keeps everyone aligned. Don't double up on contains. If allergens are already in the ingredients list, don't add another contains line. It's actually non-compliant in the EU. And language rules matter. Labels must be in the official language of the EU country where the product is sold. Use templates for your layout. Templates are your friend. They make allergen emphasis like bold text stays consistent across languages. Watch those small packs. Small packs seem easy to skip details on, but exemptions are limited. Always double check that allergen info is clear and compliant. Bottom line, multilingual labeling isn't just translation, it's a controlled process. Templates, audits, and one master sheet can keep you out of trouble. So let's break down the Great Britain allergen labelling rules and Natasha's law. First, the legal framework is the Food Information to Consumers Regulation, FIC. Originally the EU regulation and still applies in the UK post-Brexit through domestic legislation. Requires businesses to provide accurate allergen information for the 14 major allergens we have already identified. For non-pre-packed foods, allergen info can be given in any format, even verbally, but businesses must clearly indicate that customers can ask for allergen details. Now, Natasha's law was introduced in October 2021 and changed the game for pre-packed for direct sale foods, the PPDS foods, meaning foods that are packed on the same premises where it's sold. So think sandwiches, salads, or cakes made in a caffeine wrap before display. Under Natasha's law, these items must have a full ingredients list on the packaging, and allergens must be clearly highlighted, usually in bold. Labels must be legible in a minimum font size and not obscured by other text. This was introduced when Natasha in Lapérouse tragically died after eating a baguette that contained sesame seeds not listed on the label. Her death exposed a loophole in UK law, and Natasha's law closed that gap to protect allergy sufferers. Now let's look at some key enforcement hotspots with allergens in the UK before discussing a case study for this jurisdiction. As we've indicated, the PPS compliance and the accuracy of free-from claims is a hot enforcement issue in the UK. These are mistakes that can directly impact consumer safety seriously. There's a strong push to retrain outlets producing sandwiches and baking goods in-house. Why? Because these businesses are often the ones handling multiple allergens in close quarters, and a single slip-up can lead to undeclared allergens on a PPDS label. Maintaining ingredient databases is critical. Quick and accurate PPDS label printing depends on having up-to-date ingredient information. Without this, businesses risk mislabeling and enforcement action. And finally, we need to be aware of vulnerabilities in but significantly contaminated ingredients. These are sometimes hiding serious risks like spices, seasonings, or condiments that can carry allergens deep into the supply chain without notice for some time. And that brings us to the mustard peanut contamination case that was triggered last year. And the incident shows exactly how seemingly a minor ingredient can trigger major national recall and disrupt the entire food chain. In September 2024, the Food Standards Agency issued an urgent warning after discovering that mustard ingredients imported from India were contaminated with peanuts. The contamination affected over 130 products, including sauces, dips, spice mixes, and even pre-packed sandwiches. The recall was precautionary but extensive, involving major brands and food service businesses. The contamination wasn't in finished product, but in widely used ingredient, mustard powder, distributed through multiple supply chains. Tracing and removing affected products was extremely challenging and time-consuming. Peanut allergy is one of the most severe food allergies with a very low reaction threshold. As little as 0.2 milligrams of peanut protein can trigger reactions in 1% of allergic individuals. FSA had to advise all peanut allergic consumers to avoid eating any food containing mustard until the investigation was complete. It raised questions about how and whether current practices with precautionary allergen labelling are sufficient. And the final jurisdiction for a close review of the requirements is China. And China's allergen labelling requirements under GB 77182025 include the 8 allergens mandated, being gluten-containing cereals, crustaceans, fish, eggs, peanuts, soybeans, milk, and tree nuts. Potentially plus sesame. It's unclear as to whether sesame is going to be included, but at the moment it's precautionary to include on the label due to its increasing recognition as a significant allergen globally. So China has taken the 8 major allergens from the WHO list, and it takes full effect in March 2027 after the 2-year transition period. Businesses must clearly identify allergens either within the ingredient list or in a warning statement next to it. And the allergen name should be highlighted, such as in bold or an underlined text. Precautionary statements are required if cross-contact is possible during production, and certain highly refined products like soybean oil are exempt. So China's new allergen labelling standard is coming into force in March 2027. There's a bit of time to get ready. So what would businesses selling in China do at this point in time? A gap analysis should be commenced to see where current labels fall short and make sure translations are accurate and consistent. Formulations should be audited and specs for the Chinese market, because the regulation requires clear labelling for the 8 major allergens should be identified. It's also smart to keep a Mandarin glossary for allergen terminology to keep everything consistent, and reserve space on your labels for QR codes and declarations, since China is moving towards digital labelling as well. Keep monitoring the guidance update to the next over the next 2 years, as we have requirements still evolving. So I'm returning now to the comparison table, and just to revisit as a summary of what we've discussed again. And so where some allergens like milk, egg, peanuts, and tree nuts appear across all jurisdictions, as you can see, the bottom part of the table has some variances. I'll just take some time to quickly go through some of the exemptions. I won't spend too much time on this, but there are some key exemptions in each jurisdiction, and some of them are consistent from one to the other. Highly refined oils, such as refined peanut or soybean oil, are automatically exempt because the refining, bleaching, and deodorizing process removes allergenic proteins. So crude oils are not exempt. Secondly, the FDA can grant scientific or regulatory exemptions through a formal petition process, typically when an ingredient contains no allergenic protein or does not pose a health risk. The scope of FALCPAs does not cover all products. USDA regulated items like meat, poultry, and certain egg products, alcoholic beverages, drugs, and other other personal care products like cosmetics, and also unpackaged products not covered here. And pet foods and supplements fall under different regulatory frameworks I haven't talked about tonight. Turning to some exemptions in Australia and New Zealand. Common examples again, highly refined oils from peanuts, soybeans, and protein remains. And remember that for these exemptions to apply, you need to be able to demonstrate this with your own evidence to be able to substantiate in the event you're not declaring. Alcohol distillates such as cereal-based spirits wherein gluten, proteins are destroyed are exempt. Cereals processed into glucose, dextrose, or maltodextrin when protein is removed. Fish gelatin or used as fining agents, and derivatives are also, when they're protein-free, are exempt. So regulatory authorities such as FSANZ in Australia periodically review these exemptions and based on advances in protein detection and emerging clinical evidence. So we will also remain ongoingly vigilant in regards to the allergenic proteins. In the EU and Great Britain, in addition to the 14 allergens, there are numerous exemptions for derivatives that have been scientifically proven not to cause adverse reactions. And I won't go through all those, but similarly, like Australia and New Zealand, and these are in the provided in the actual Annex to 2 in detail. And also we have the key exemptions in China, where refined, bleached and deodorized oils such as soybean and peanut oil are again exempt because the allergenic protein has been removed. Also, fermentation-derived cultures and enzymes qualify for exemption where no allergenic protein remains. And also in regards to wheat-derived glucose syrups, again, where we don't have the proteins. And this approach mirrors Codex and EU logic. So China is actively updating its allergen risk assessment methodologies and clinical challenge data to establish population-specific thresholds, meaning this exemption list may actually evolve as local evidence grows. So finally, I just want to look at how I can give you some tips on harmonising multi-jurisdictional layers, and really what you'd be operating a robust allergen labelling system has multiple facets, of which these various elements are important, but they're not necessarily an exhaustive list. But it's a good foundation for a robust system, that you start with a single source of truth, being a global allergen specification that captures ingredient level details such as the allergenic source, species, gluten cereal, sulfite levels, market specific display names, power decisions and exemptions, all maintained under strict ownership, version control and effective dates. From this, a rules engine can be auto-generating compliant declarations for each jurisdiction within your system. US and the US requirements, the EU mandates can all be built in. And when you're looking at artwork templates, locking key blocks like your ingredients and contains, make sure consistent spacing and font standards apply across markets can be automated within a system. The PAL labelling should always follow a decision tree, not default, not a blanket statement used, and only when a residual risk remains. Must be specific, may contain peanuts. Change control processes must catch your substitutions triggered by a supplier, site, formulation, or other changes, and need to be built in. These change control processes need to be built into your system. Finally, a verification through targeted ELISA testing, periodic capability checks, and barcode linked specs on production lines. Ensure compliance and integrity before removing a precautionary statement. And just engage in regards to managing formats and finally to achieve true formatting harmonisation, businesses need a locked multilingual glossary in terms and a terms table that reflects your local regulatory language for the food to be sold. Plain English for the US, FSAN's prescribed names for Australia and New Zealand as per Schedule 9, an extra 2 terms for the EU and Great Britain with local language packs where applicable. And also standard Chinese terms with proper language triggers. Also, your system should be supported by species lists for tree nuts, for fish, for crustacea, along with permitted display forms of declarations. A formatting matrix that defines what, where, and how to display declarations is also essential. Bold in list plus adjacent summary statements or contained statements, or the emphasis with the ingredient lists for the jurisdiction if it's EU or Great Britain and China. For instance, in China, it must be stipulated that the contains is after the ingredients list. Robust QA workflows underpin these systems. Checks against specifications, jurisdictional specific and visual verification, emphasis and font size must also be finally signed off with built-in approval systems that you operate with your SOPs. Sign off with timestamps and ensure that you are naming and numbering your artwork versions. Do not get them mixed up. Micro templates are very useful as well to streamline your execution across markets. So establish your templates for the actual format requirements for each market on your templates. And also don't forget ongoing training and your KPIs, and build in some measurements in regards to auto generation for when creating labels, but also ensure you're keeping tight complaint metrics. So that's just the end of our webinar just now, and it's now time, we have some time now for Q&A.